Mustached Tom here to review the series Terminator Zero. Now, this is an interesting one, as I have not seen any trailers for it. However, the reason I know of its existence is that I had heard certain people talking about how this was continuing on the downfall of the Terminator series, and that made me a little bit confused. Because I heard simultaneously that it was an animated series, meaning that its departure from Terminator would be pretty self-evident already. So I decided to give it my own shot, look at it for myself, and see if those initial things people were saying about this series were true. And boy howdy do I disagree firmly with that sentiment. I think that Terminator Zero is as good, if not matching the same quality as both Terminator 1 and 2. That is how good I think this series is. In fact, I would dare argue that this should have been where Terminator 3 should have started taking place, in terms of, continuing to ask these questions in a meaningful way, and simultaneously separating itself enough from Terminator 1 and 2, while simultaneously creating its own unique story in the process without disrespecting what came before, because that is what Terminator has come to do in its later iterations. In fact, in the newest iteration of Terminator, they kill John Connor, disrespecting Terminator 1 and 2, if anything. So it is way more interesting and way more compelling to me to see a completely different cast of characters and have that juxtaposed to everything that has come before. And again, matching the energy of both Terminator 1 and 2. Which again is what I'm going to be arguing here. So, much like any Terminator story, we have two diverging timelines. We have our present day and our future day of, past Judgment Day, of when Terminators take over and their war with humans is ending very poorly for the humans. So, we have these two diverging timelines that are, coexisting, and we have an interesting setup, if you don't mind me saying. We have a main character, this father, who's, raising these three kids who have different young perspectives about how they view stuff. One is enamored by technology, one is very much following her beaten path of wanting and desiring the youth that she is, versus what she's going to have to come up against. And the third character, the other son, the youngest son, I'll admit, his character pushing and pulling against it isn't as well established in this particular season, but I digress. So I'm willing to point out this series' flaws, just to be as objective as possible. Despite that, I will say the father's dynamic becomes rather interesting. So spoiler alert here if what I have said thus far has intrigued you, just by saying that this is as good as Terminator 1 and 2. Moving forward, I'll be mentioning spoilers, so if you're intrigued by that already, I would urge you to stop watching this video and to go to Netflix and to watch this season, and then come back for the spoiler section, which is now. So it turns out that the father was a part of the future timeline and decided to head back. Of course, with timeline being at play, they have to once again explain how timeline works. Now remember that this is a new story for all intents and purposes. And I think that the way they explain it, has been explained in different things before in this sort of way, where, if you head back in time, it's essentially an equivalent to the butterfly effect. For those who might not be aware of it, if you affect the smallest thing in going back in time, that will start to ripple affect other things, thus, in this iteration, creating a new timeline, a new present, as it were. And that is very much what they are fighting for, because the bleak future that they have in store is not one that they want to repeat. So that is what the father does. He goes back in time, or to a new timeline, as it were, because now he's setting up a new divergence, as it were, a new timeline. And with his new children in tow, he's setting up a new future with them as the precursors to whatever may come next. And, to make matters more complex, he is dealing with his own version of Skynet, named Koneko, I believe the name was. I should have written it down just to make sure I got the pronunciation right, but Point being is that it is essentially a advanced AI that is split into 3 different, representations of something, and they all seem to operate under the idea of wondering why this individual is trying to do everything he can to prevent this Skynet. And it does raise a lot of interesting back and forth, and dare I suggest, I think some of it's better than Terminator 1 and 2. I think that, leave it to the Japanese to actually bring back some courage and push the boundaries a little bit more than us Americans in certain times. I mean, they do it with Godzilla all the time, so this isn't very surprising to me that they would definitely hit the nail a little bit harder than Americans would when it comes to this sort of aspect. And that bringing us to the core questions of, what is humanity's worth, essentially, in a base question. What is humanity worth saving? We're going to the broadest, philosophical question that you can probably ever think of. Why are we here? What are we meant to do? These type of questions. In the first Terminator movies, there are a lot of lines. Hell, the most memorable section of Terminator 1 and 2, arguably, is Sarah talking about fate is what you make. That is the quote that is very implanted in the Terminator franchise, that fate isn't predetermined, it is what you, the individual, makes of your own, being, your own, in the beings around you, is sort of the idea behind fate is what you make. And what I really like about this adaptation is that they never actually use the line, at least I didn't see it anywhere, but they definitely point to it. And I think that shows a level of not only respect, but it makes you think of the line without having to say the line. And I think that's way more interesting in terms of writing quality, when you don't have to feel like you're backpedaling to the past to show that you're still respecting the past. I think that is brilliant writing. It achieves a lot, really. And these back and forths about, what is humanity, and bringing these robots, you have the Terminator also going back in time to, assassinate one job, one mission, and then the reprogramming, and, what that involves, what that means, it does do that in this series. It picks the eldest son of the three, telling him that he will be isolated from the rest of the family and that he will play a massive part in this, this resurgence. So their own version of John Connor without disrespecting John Connor, because this takes place in Japan and with its own version of AI. So it's a lot more acceptable to take on as a attitude, or perhaps a premise, as it were, because again, it doesn't infringe upon the character's legacy at all. It rather suggests that there just happens to be a separate character that lives somewhere else in the world who also just happens to also play an important role in the future. That is exactly where I think Terminator should have been going since number 3. Outside of saying, John Connor's the one, John Connor's the one, maybe there were other people around the world, and saying there were few destined to change their fates, plural. And that is how you move the Terminator franchise moving forward, instead of erasing John Connor, which is completely unnecessary. So this, to me, is Terminator 3, by all metrics. Like, this is where Terminator 3 should have been all along, in Terminator 0. So that is definitely where I'm coming with it. So we have the father who created, who went back in time, created his own version of the Terminator, the good Terminator for simplicity's sake, and she chooses to become, and this is again really diving into other things that I don't think get talked about, depicting gender and versus sex and all that, because the robot explicitly says, I chose the gender of feminine. Not to be female, but to choose feminine. Because females, because gender and sex are technically linked, but they are not one-to-one, which is a distinction this series manages to understand, so thank you for having brain cells. Unlike a certain number of people that seem to think that those two things are interchangeable. Stupidity on a level I will never understand, but hey. At any rate, this really gets to a unique, talking point from her, is that she chooses this because she is cataloged backwards and she's looking at the gendered perspective from a long, series, and she says it as clear as day. Most females, never all, most, are of the caring, nurturing type, and most males are the aggressors, the attackers, the destroyers, and arguably the defenders, because those two things are slightly different from one another. And I do think that conflict is very eminent throughout without ever having to necessarily spell out the defender role per se. They just do it through the actions of the characters. The future woman that goes back in the time, the one that you see at the middle of the poster there, it turns out that, she was the one who gave birth to this father who went back in time. So there's a lot going on there. And now she's looking after these, 3 kids, moving forward. But again, raising these new dynamics of, again, how we see even gender, how a robot would understand gender, and separating that idea from sex, because again, robots, they do not occupy a sex. I mean, right? They don't share our biology in the most literal sense, so. But then they would have to take on the gender, the ideas of what femininity are in this case. And yet, despite that, she still finds when the time and opportunity is when our youngsters are in variable trouble, that she too is very capable of turning in that switch. Just warrior mode must be activated. She too can just equally be a defender because that is what she is programmed to be. But she also feels, as she puts it, and that alone, that added feeling, being programmed, allots a one of those philosophical questions. Can you program a robot to feel, and what does that mean? I mean, is it running code to do it? How is the code running to do it? All of these questions come into play. We see her crying at a certain point. How is that achieved? What is activating in those processes that gets her to do that? For us humans, we, when you study biology enough, you know that certain chemical stuff happens in the brain, it releases outward. It's even convoluted on that scale, so just take that and amplify it to a machine, and now you have an additional layer to the emotion. So yeah, very interesting stuff. In terms of action, there's tons of deaths. The Terminator plows through plenty of people, like through this police station at a certain point, very reminiscent of the first two Terminator movies, without ever feeling like it's completely ripping it off. It's still, clearly getting close to it, but never, one for one. It feels like it's close again. And again, these movements feel very natural. Of course the police would be, investigating, and the police, would get involved to a degree. So that seems like everything just follows in the way that this series goes about getting to the places that it needs to get to, without ever really feeling contrived. Complicated, sure, but never contrived, which is greatly appreciated, again, in the writing quality here. So if I were to give a score, I think I'd probably go with a 9 out of 10. Like I said, I don't know. I think this might be my favorite Terminator thing to ever come out, potentially. Maybe I need to rewatch Terminator 1 and 2. I know that those movies still really hold up, but this is really good material as well, and it's definitely from a different perspective, so again, highly would recommend.